Hi everybody, going to do a video series on reassembling a R69S BMW motor. This is a 1964 bike that came in for a complete rebuild and slinger cleaning, so we took the crank out, evaluated everything, and now it's time to reassemble. Luckily the crank on this bike was perfect, low mileage bike, and after a good cleaning it's ready to go back together. So I'm going to walk you through that process. To get the crank ready, one thing I've done is I pulled out the key for the flywheel, and then I put a little bit of valve lapping compound on this taper and on the flywheel taper. This is where the flywheel rides. And then with this clamped in a vise, I set the flywheel on there and spin it around a little bit. Just what I'm doing there is making sure that there's a good contact between the taper of the crankshaft and the flywheel, which there is in this case. So I put the key back in, and then we're ready to get this crank assembled. So we're going to be working on the rear of the crank. These holes here are what feed oil to the big end of the connecting rods, and so I'm going to add some assembly lube into that hole to make sure that we have oil there on startup, and just spin the rod around to get that oil going into there. And the next thing I'm going to do is install the rear slinger. Here we go. Some people use new slingers. There was nothing wrong with these old ones. They're in good shape, and after they're really cleaned out, ready to reinstall them. So place the slinger on the back of the crank and use the 2 screws that retain the slinger. And tighten those down. I've put some blue Loctite on these screws just to make sure that they don't want to back out. And once you've got those screws tightened down, you can take a small punch, and from the factory they were staked into place, and that's what we're going to do also, is just use a little punch to move a little bit of that slinger, the edge of the slinger, into the screw, just as insurance, added insurance that these aren't going to back out. So take a small punch. And just lightly stake these 2 screws, just like that. The next thing we'll do is install the rear crank spacer. It is thinner than the front crank spacer. It has a beveled edge, and you want to put that beveled edge towards the crankshaft, like that. And then we are ready to install the rear main bearing onto the crank. You want to heat it up. I've got it on a hot plate here, and once it's nice and hot, it should start to go on. It should slip right onto the back of the crankshaft like that. You can use the flywheel nut and a sleeve if you want to make sure that that is pressed on all the way. If it doesn't go on all the way just by itself, you can use the flywheel nut to make sure it's down all the way. So there we go. And we'll leave that on there till it cools, and that's how you install the rear main bearing. The next thing we're going to do is work on the front main bearing carrier. I've got it heated up, and going to install the front main bearing. And when this carrier is hot, that bearing should slide right in. The later ones were aluminum. This is an older one that's steel. And then we're going to install the oiler plate that goes on top of that main bearing. And you'll notice that there's a small hole, oil feed hole, in this carrier, and that's where the little tube needs to go. So make sure you line those up. 4 bolts and wave washers. I've had a little blue Loctite. And go ahead and tighten those 4 bolts down to hold the oiler plate. Okay. And then the last thing to do to prepare this is to install the oil pump gears. There's 2 gears. The one with the threads will go into the top, and the one without goes on the bottom. We're going to add some assembly lube to those bores, into the gears, before we put them in there. Just like so. That's the oil pump gears. So this is ready to go on. We're going to set it aside and get the crankcase in the oven, heat it up to about 275 degrees, and then we'll be ready to install the crankshaft. One more thing you want to do before you start reassembly is to get the camshaft all ready to go back into the case. I've replaced the bearings on the camshaft. There's one on the front and one on the rear. To do that, use a shop press. You press off the timing gear, aluminum timing gear. There's a key that holds that positions that. You'll take the key out, then you'll remove this bearing carrier here. There's a circlip, then you remove, and then the bearing comes out. And then you also just press off the bearing on the rear, and reassembly is the reverse of that. So you'll want to have the camshaft ready to install. When you heat up that case and install the crankshaft, you can work while the case is hot and get the camshaft installed too. So in the next video we will install the crankshaft and the camshaft.